year was 390 BC, and the eternal city that would one day rule the Mediterranean was nothing more than a collection of 7 hills overlooking the Tiber River. On this particular July morning, as the sun cast long shadows across the Roman countryside, roughly 15,000 Roman soldiers marched north along the Via Salaria. They carried the crimson standards of the Republic, their bronze armor gleaming in the early light. None of them knew they were walking toward one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman history. A defeat so complete, so shocking that it would haunt the Roman psyche for generations to come. At the head of this army rode 6 military tribunes, the elected commanders of Rome's legions. They believed they were marching to face another routine barbarian incursion. Instead, they were about to encounter Brennus, a Gallic chieftain whose very name would become synonymous with Rome's darkest hour. Within hours, the bodies of Roman citizens would litter the banks of the Allia River, and the proud city of Rome would lie defenseless before a foreign army for the first and only time in its early history. But how did the future masters of the world find themselves so vulnerable? How did a people who would eventually conquer Gaul, Britain, and the known world suffer such a devastating defeat at the hands of the very barbarians they would later subjugate? The answer lies not just in military tactics or battlefield strategy, but in the complex web of Roman politics, society, and the fatal overconfidence that nearly destroyed the Republic before it could truly begin. This is the story of Rome's first great defeat, a catastrophe that would reshape Roman military thinking, transform their approach to warfare, and ultimately forge the iron discipline that would carry the legions to the ends of the earth. It's a tale of hubris and humiliation, of political intrigue and military disaster, but also of resilience and renewal. For while the Battle of the Allia represents Rome's greatest early failure, it also marks the beginning of Rome's greatest transformation. The Roman Republic in 390 BC, a city on the rise. To understand the magnitude of Rome's defeat at the Allia River, we must first understand what Rome was in 390 BC, and more importantly, what it was not. This was not the Rome of Caesar's legions or Augustus's empire. This was not yet the Rome that would build the Pantheon or stretch from Britain to Mesopotamia. In 390 BC, Rome was still very much a regional power, one city-state among many in the complex tapestry of central Italian politics. The Roman Republic had been established just over a century earlier in 509 BC, when the last king, Tarquin the Proud, had been expelled in a popular uprising. The Romans had replaced their monarchy with a system that would become the foundation of Western political thought. A republic governed by elected magistrates, guided by a senate of elder statesmen and theoretically accountable to the people. At the apex of this system stood the 2 consuls, elected annually with supreme executive power. Below them were the praetors who administered justice and the quaestors who managed the treasury. The Senate, composed of former magistrates, provided continuity and wisdom, while the popular assemblies gave voice to the citizens. It was an elegant system, but in 390 BC it was still finding its balance. The Roman army of this period reflected both the strengths and limitations of early republican society. Unlike the professional legions that would later conquer the world, the Roman military was essentially a citizen militia. Every Roman male between the ages of 17 and 46 was liable for military service, but only those who owned property worth at least 4,000 asses, the minimum census requirement, were expected to provide their own equipment and serve in the heavy infantry. These citizen soldiers formed the backbone of the Manipular Legion, Rome's revolutionary military formation. Unlike the rigid phalanx of the Greeks, the Manipular system organized troops into smaller, more flexible units called maniples. Each maniple contained about 120 men and could operate somewhat independently, allowing for greater tactical flexibility on the broken terrain of central Italy. The hastati formed the front line, young men in their 20s eager to prove themselves in battle. Behind them stood the principes, men in their prime, experienced and reliable. The triarii, the veteran third line, provided the final reserve and gave birth to the Romans, saying, "It has come to the triarii," meaning the situation was desperate indeed. Each legionnaire carried the distinctive Roman scutum, a large rectangular shield made of wood and leather, reinforced with iron. They wielded the gladius, a short stabbing sword perfectly designed for close combat, and carried two pila, heavy javelins designed to punch through enemy armor and bend on impact, making them impossible to throw back. But perhaps more important than their equipment was their training. Roman soldiers drilled constantly, learning to move as one organism, to maintain formation under pressure, and to follow orders without question. They built camps every night, complete with ditches and palisades, turning warfare into an exercise in engineering as much as combat. This military machine had already proven itself against Rome's immediate neighbors. The Equi, who had once raided Roman territory with impunity, had been pacified. The Volsci, traditional enemies to the south, had been pushed back from Roman borders. Most significantly, the Romans had conquered their greatest local rival, the Etruscan city of Veii, in 396 BC after a 10-year siege that rivaled Homer's Troy in its duration and determination. The fall of Veii had been a watershed moment for Rome. The city had controlled much of the trade along the Tiber River and possessed some of the richest farmland in central Italy. Its conquest not only eliminated a major threat but also provided Rome with vast new territories and wealth. Roman confidence soared, and with it Roman ambition. Yet this very success contained the seeds of future disaster. Victory over Veii had given the Romans a sense of invincibility, a belief that their military system was superior to anything they might face. They had defeated the sophisticated Etruscans with their advanced technology and centuries of military experience. Surely no barbarian tribe could pose a serious threat to Roman arms. This overconfidence was reinforced by Roman attitudes toward their northern neighbors. The Gauls, or Keltoi as the Greeks called them, were viewed by most Romans as little more than painted savages. They were tall, fair-haired warriors who fought with more courage than discipline, more fury than technique. They had no cities to speak of, no literature, no philosophy. They were everything that the Romans, heirs to Greek civilization and Etruscan sophistication, believed themselves not to be. Roman society itself reflected this confidence and cultural superiority. The city had grown dramatically since the establishment of the Republic, with an estimated population of around 100,000 people spread across the 7 hills. The Forum Romanum served as the beating heart of political and commercial life, where senators debated, merchants traded, and citizens gathered to hear the latest news from across the growing Roman territories. The Roman home, the Domus, reflected both the values and aspirations of republican society. Built around a central atrium where clients would gather each morning to pay their respects to their patron. These homes were designed to display wealth and status while maintaining the traditional Roman virtues of discipline and restraint. The paterfamilias, the male head of household, wielded absolute authority over his family, including the power of life and death over his children. A reminder that Rome remained at its core a martial society. Roman religion, too, emphasized duty and discipline over passion or mysticism. The Romans worshipped a pantheon borrowed largely from the Greeks but adapted to Roman sensibilities. Jupiter Optimus Maximus, greatest and best, ruled from his temple on the Capitoline Hill. Mars, the god of war, was second only to Jupiter in importance, fitting for a society that had grown through conquest. Vesta, goddess of the hearth, was tended by virgin priestesses whose sacred duty was to maintain the eternal flame that symbolized Rome's continuity. But perhaps most revealing of Roman character were the stories they told about their own past. They celebrated figures like Cincinnatus, the dictator who saved Rome from invasion, and then returned to his plow, refusing all honors. They honored Horatius Cocles, who single-handedly held a bridge against an entire army. They revered Mucius Scaevola, who thrust his hand into a fire to demonstrate Roman courage to an enemy king. These were not stories of divine intervention or supernatural heroes. They were tales of duty, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to the state. They reflected a society that believed virtue could triumph over any obstacle, that discipline could overcome any enemy, that Roman character was superior to any force on earth. It was this Rome, confident, disciplined, and supremely sure of its own superiority, that would march north to face Brennus and his Gallic army in the summer of 390 BC. And it was precisely this confidence, this unshakable belief in Roman invincibility, that would make the coming defeat so devastating and so complete. The Gallic migration, barbarians at the gate. While Rome was consolidating its power in central Italy, massive changes were occurring beyond the Alps that would soon threaten everything the Romans had built. Across the mountain passes that separated the Mediterranean world from the forests of northern Europe, entire peoples were on the move in one of history's great migrations. The Gauls were not a single tribe, but a collection of related Celtic peoples who shared similar languages, customs, and ways of war. They had originated in the regions we now know as France, Belgium, and Western Germany, but by the 5th century BC, population pressure, climate change, and the lure of richer lands to the south had set them in motion. Wave after wave of Celtic warriors had crossed the Alps, settling in the fertile Po Valley that the Romans called Cisalpine Gaul, Gaul on this side of the mountains. They brought with them their families, their livestock, and their appetite for war. Unlike the Romans, who fought for territory and political advantage, the Gauls often fought for the sheer joy of combat, for personal glory, and for the wealth that victory could bring. These were not the primitive savages that Roman propaganda would later portray. Gallic society was sophisticated in its own way, with skilled metalworkers, accomplished artists, and a complex social hierarchy. Their warriors wore chainmail that was superior to Roman armor, wielded long iron swords that could cleave through bronze helmets, and carried shields decorated with intricate patterns that told the stories of their deeds. But it was their approach to warfare that made them truly formidable. Where Romans fought in disciplined formations, maintaining their lines at all costs, Gauls preferred individual combat and sudden, overwhelming charges. They would strip to the waist before battle, their bodies painted with blue woad, and rush screaming toward their enemies with a fury that could break even seasoned troops. The psychological impact of a Gallic charge was enormous. These were men who stood 6 feet tall or more at a time when most Romans barely reached 5.5 feet. Their hair was bleached with lime to make it stand upright like a mane, and their voices, raised in their terrifying war cry, could be heard for miles. Roman historians would later write of the fear that gripped their soldiers at the first sight of these painted giants rushing toward them with weapons raised. By 390 BC, several major Gallic tribes had established themselves in northern Italy. The Insubres controlled the region around what would become Milan. The Cenomani held the area near modern Brescia. The Boii had settled in the eastern Po Valley, while the Senones, led by their chief Brennus, occupied the Adriatic coast near present-day Rimini. It was the Senones who would play the decisive role in Rome's coming disaster. But their march south was not initially directed at Rome at all. Instead, it began with a dispute over the Etruscan city of Clusium, modern Chiusi, located about 120 miles north of Rome. Clusium was an ancient city, one of the 12 great centers of Etruscan civilization. Its people were sophisticated urban dwellers who had built their wealth on trade and agriculture. But by 391 BC, they found themselves under pressure from Gallic tribes who coveted their rich farmlands and urban wealth. When negotiation failed, the Senones under Brennus laid siege to the city. The Clusians, desperate for aid, sent ambassadors to Rome requesting assistance against the barbarian invaders. This request placed the Roman Senate in a difficult position. Clusium was not a Roman ally, and the Romans had no formal obligation to provide aid. Moreover, Etruscans had been Rome's enemies for generations. It had been only 5 years since the conquest of Veii, yet there were compelling reasons to intervene. If the Gauls successfully conquered Clusium, they would control a strategic position that threatened Roman trade routes and might encourage other Gallic tribes to push further south. More importantly, Rome's growing power brought with it growing responsibilities. A strong response to Gallic aggression would send a message to other potential enemies that Rome would not tolerate threats to the stability of central Italy. The Senate's decision would prove fateful. Rather than send a military expedition, they chose diplomacy. 3 ambassadors from the prestigious Fabii family were dispatched to Clusium with instructions to negotiate a peaceful resolution to the conflict. This seemed like a prudent choice. The Fabii were experienced diplomats, and avoiding war would spare Roman lives and resources. But diplomacy required more than noble intentions. It required understanding the people with whom you were negotiating, their customs, their values, and their view of the world. The Roman ambassadors possessed none of this understanding. They approached Brennus with the arrogance typical of civilized men dealing with barbarians, demanding that he withdraw from Clusian territory and return to his own lands. Brennus, however, was not impressed by Roman authority or Roman demands. He was a war chief whose position depended on his ability to provide his followers with land and plunder. He had not brought his people across the Alps and hundreds of miles south simply to turn back at the first sign of opposition. His response to the Roman ultimatum was blunt. If the Romans wanted the Senones to leave Clusian territory, they were welcome to make them. What happened next violated every principle of diplomatic immunity and international law. The Roman ambassadors, rather than reporting back to Rome, decided to take matters into their own hands. They joined the Clusian garrison and participated in a sortie against the Gallic camp. During the fighting, one of the Fabii killed a Gallic chieftain in single combat. This act transformed a local conflict into a matter of honor and blood vengeance. In Gallic culture, the killing of a war leader demanded satisfaction, and the fact that it had been done by men who claimed to be neutral negotiators made it an unforgivable insult. Brennus immediately broke off the siege of Clusium and sent ambassadors to Rome demanding that the Fabii be handed over for punishment. The Roman response revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of republican government. The Senate, recognizing the gravity of the situation, was inclined to hand over the ambassadors who had so flagrantly violated their neutral status. Justice demanded it, and practical politics suggested that appeasing Brennus might avoid a larger conflict. But the matter was not solely in the Senate's hands. The Fabii were members of one of Rome's most distinguished patrician families, and they had powerful connections throughout the Roman establishment. When the issue came before the popular assembly for final decision, political influence proved stronger than justice or wisdom. Not only were the Fabii not punished, but they were actually elected to positions as military tribunes for the coming year. This decision sealed Rome's fate. Brennus had offered the Romans a way out, justice for the violation of diplomatic immunity. Instead, Rome had chosen to reward the men who had created the crisis. From Brennus's perspective, Rome had declared itself an enemy not just through the actions of its ambassadors, but through its refusal to make amends for their crimes. The Gallic army broke camp and began the march south toward Rome. They moved slowly, allowing word of their approach to spread, giving the Romans every opportunity to reconsider their position and deliver the justice that had been demanded. But no further embassies came from Rome, no offers of compensation or punishment for the guilty parties. As the Gallic host approached Roman territory, its size grew. Warriors from other tribes joined Brennus, eager for their share of Roman plunder. Gallic society measured a man's worth by his success in war, and here was an opportunity to strike at one of central Italy's greatest powers. By the time the army reached the Allia River, just 11 miles from Rome, it may have numbered as many as 30,000 warriors. The stage was now set for one of the most decisive battles in early Roman history. On one side stood the disciplined legions of the Roman Republic, confident in their training, their equipment, and their proven tactics. On the other side waited the painted warriors of Gaul, fighting for honor, plunder, and the glory that came from defeating a great enemy. But this was more than just a clash between two armies. It was a collision between two completely different ways of life. Roman discipline against Gallic fury, Mediterranean civilization against Celtic barbarism, the ordered society of the city-state against the warrior culture of the migrating tribes. The outcome would determine not just the fate of Rome, but the future course of European history. Either march to disaster, politics, and panic. News of Brennus's march south reached Rome like a thunderclap on a clear day. For generations, Romans had grown accustomed to fighting their wars on enemy territory or along their borders. The idea that a foreign army might actually threaten the city itself was almost incomprehensible. Yet here was a barbarian host, estimated by terrified refugees at numbers that grew with each telling, advancing steadily down the Via Salaria toward the Seven Hills. The Roman response revealed both the strengths and fatal weaknesses of republican government in crisis. The Senate convened an emergency session, summoning all available magistrates and former officials to debate the unprecedented threat. The consulship for 390 BC was held by Marcus Furius Camillus, the hero of the siege of Veii and arguably Rome's greatest military commander. But Camillus had been exiled earlier that year on charges of unfairly distributing the spoils from his victory, leaving Rome without its most experienced general at the moment of greatest peril. In Camillus's absence, military command fell to the 6 elected military tribunes who served as the chief magistrates that year. These were capable men: Quintus Sulpicius Longus, Quintus Servilius, Servius Cornelius Maluginensis, Marcus Papirius Mugellanus, Gaius Servilius Ahala, and Lucius Aemilius. But none possessed Camillus's experience or reputation. More critically, the collegial nature of their command meant that crucial military decisions would be made by committee rather than by a single decisive leader. The debate in the Senate revealed the depth of Roman misunderstanding about their enemy. Many senators argued that the Gallic threat was exaggerated, that these barbarians would never dare attack Rome directly, that they would withdraw once they realized the strength of Roman defenses. Others, perhaps more prescient, warned that the Gauls had already proven their determination by marching this far south and showed no signs of backing down. The fundamental question facing the Romans was whether to defend the city from behind its walls or to meet the enemy in the field. Rome's fortifications, known as the Servian Wall, were formidable but not complete. Large sections of the city remained unfortified, relying on the natural defenses of the Seven Hills and the assumption that no enemy would ever penetrate so deeply into Roman territory. A siege would also mean abandoning the rich farmlands of the Ager Romanus to Gallic plunder and leaving Rome's allies to face the barbarians alone. On the other hand, meeting the Gauls in open battle carried enormous risks. Roman military doctrine was based on fighting civilized enemies who shared certain assumptions about warfare, that battles had objectives beyond mere destruction, that victories could be negotiated, that defeated enemies would honor agreements. The Gauls, by all accounts, followed no such rules. They fought for plunder and glory, cared nothing for Roman concepts of honor, and might very well massacre prisoners and civilians alike. The decision ultimately fell to the military tribunes, and they chose to fight. This decision reflected both Roman military tradition and political necessity. The Roman state was built on the principle of citizen soldiers defending their homes and families. To cower behind walls while barbarians ravaged Roman territory would be to betray everything the Republic stood for. Moreover, the recent victory over Veii had filled the Romans with confidence in their military supremacy. But if the decision to fight was politically inevitable, the execution revealed fatal flaws in Roman planning and leadership. The military tribunes had perhaps 2 weeks to prepare for the most important battle in Roman history. Yet they made a series of crucial errors that would doom their army before the first javelin was thrown. The first mistake was strategic. Rather than choosing the battlefield carefully, taking advantage of Roman engineering skills to prepare defensive positions, the tribunes decided to march north and meet the Gauls wherever they chose to fight. This decision handed the initiative to Brennus, allowing him to select the time and place of battle according to his own advantages. The second mistake was tactical. The Roman manipular system was designed for flexibility and coordination between different types of troops. Yet the tribunes made no effort to adapt their formations to face an enemy whose tactics were completely different from anything they had encountered. They would deploy their legions exactly as they had against the Etruscans and other Italian enemies, without considering that Gallic warfare followed entirely different rules. The third mistake was perhaps the most serious, a failure of intelligence gathering. The Romans knew virtually nothing about their enemy beyond terrifying rumors and prejudiced assumptions. They did not know how many Gauls they would face, what weapons they carried, how they fought, or what their tactical preferences might be. This ignorance would prove catastrophic when battle was finally joined. As the Roman army prepared to march, the city itself began to show signs of panic. Citizens who could afford to do so began evacuating their families to strongholds in the Alban Hills or other fortified positions outside the immediate danger zone. The Vestal Virgins, guardians of Rome's sacred flame, made preparations to flee the city if necessary, taking with them the sacred objects that ensured Rome's divine protection. The Roman army that assembled on the Campus Martius represented the largest military force the Republic had ever fielded. 4 full legions, perhaps 15,000 heavy infantry, supported by cavalry and light troops, gathered under the standards of Rome. These were not professional soldiers but citizen farmers called away from their fields and workshops to defend their homeland. Each man carried equipment worth several years' wages for a common laborer. Their bronze helmets gleamed in the morning sun. Their iron-rimmed shields formed a wall of painted wood and leather, and their pila stood like a forest of spear points above the ranks. They had trained together, drilled together, and fought together in the campaigns that had made Rome master of central Italy. Yet for all their equipment and training, these men were marching toward a battle for which nothing in their experience had prepared them. They had fought Etruscans who used similar tactics and equipment to their own. They had defeated Volsci and Aequi who, while fierce, fought in formations they understood. But none of them had ever faced the terrifying spectacle of a Gallic charge, the psychological shock of fighting men who seemed to court death itself. The march north along the Via Salaria should have been a time for final preparations and reconnaissance. The Roman commanders should have sent scouts ahead to locate the enemy and assess their numbers and dispositions. They should have identified potential battlefields and prepared contingency plans. They should have addressed their troops, explaining the nature of the enemy they would face and how Roman tactics would need to adapt to meet this unprecedented threat. Instead, the sources suggest that the march proceeded with fatal overconfidence. The military tribunes seemed to believe that Roman superiority was so overwhelming that detailed planning was unnecessary. They would meet the barbarians, deploy in the standard formations that had proven successful against civilized enemies, and crush this Gallic rabble through the inherent superiority of Roman discipline and equipment. This overconfidence was shared by the rank and file. These men had grown up hearing stories of Roman invincibility, of victories won through courage and discipline against overwhelming odds. They were the sons and grandsons of the soldiers who had conquered Veii, who had pacified the Aequi and Volsci, who had made Rome the dominant power in central Italy. Surely no collection of painted barbarians could stand against the legions of Rome. But as the army approached the Allia River, disturbing reports began to filter back from the few scouts who had been sent ahead. The Gallic army was larger than expected, much larger. These were not just warriors, but entire families on the move, with women and children accompanying the fighters, suggesting that this was not a mere raid, but a migration that would not easily be turned back. More unsettling still were the descriptions of the Gauls themselves. Roman soldiers began to hear accounts of men who stood head and shoulders above the tallest Romans, whose war cries could be heard for miles, who painted their bodies blue and charged into battle with no regard for their own safety. Veterans who had faced many enemies admitted privately that they had never encountered anything quite like this. As July 18th, 390 BC dawned clear and hot, the two armies prepared to meet along the banks of the Allia River, a small tributary of the Tiber about 11 miles north of Rome. The Romans deployed in their traditional three-line formation, with the hastati in front, the principes in the second line, and the veteran triarii in reserve. Their flanks were covered by cavalry and light troops, and their position seemed strong, a ridge overlooking the river valley with clear fields of fire for their javelins. Across the valley, the Gallic host presented a very different spectacle. There were no neat formations, no orderly ranks of uniformly equipped soldiers. Instead, tens of thousands of warriors milled about in loose groups, their long hair bleached white, their torsos painted with intricate blue designs, their voices raised in songs and chants that carried across the water like the howling of wolves. The contrast could not have been more stark. On one side stood the disciplined might of Rome, bronze and iron glinting in perfect formation, silent except for the occasional bark of orders from centurions. On the other side waited the barbarian fury of Gaul, a sea of painted flesh and gleaming weapons that seemed to pulse with barely contained violence. Neither army knew it yet, but they were about to fight a battle that would change the course of Western civilization. The outcome would determine whether Rome survived to build its empire or became merely another footnote in the long history of rising and falling city-states. For the Gauls, victory would open the road to unimaginable riches and establish their dominance over central Italy. For the Romans, defeat would mean the destruction of everything their ancestors had built. As the morning mist rose from the Allia River, both armies made their final preparations for a battle that would be remembered for over 2,000 years. The battle unfolds when discipline met fury. The battle began, as many ancient battles did, with ritual and ceremony that would seem strange to modern eyes. As the sun climbed higher over the Allia Valley, both armies engaged in the traditional preparations that preceded combat in the ancient world. The Romans made their sacrifices to Mars and Jupiter, seeking divine favor for the coming fight. Their priests examined the entrails of sacrificial animals, looking for omens that might reveal the gods' will. The Gauls, meanwhile, engaged in their own pre-battle rituals. Warriors stripped to the waist despite the morning chill, covering their bodies with the blue woad that would make them more terrifying to their enemies and, they believed, more pleasing to their war gods. They passed horns of beer and mead from hand to hand, not to drink themselves into courage, but to honor their ancestors and bind themselves to their oath-sworn companions. The most unnerving aspect of Gallic preparation from the Roman perspective was the noise. Where Roman armies maintained disciplined silence, broken only by the occasional command, the Gallic host roared with constant sound. War songs echoed across the valley, telling of ancient victories and promising new ones. Individual warriors recited their genealogies and deeds, establishing their worthiness to fight in the battle line. The Gallic war horns, great bronze instruments that produced sounds like the bellowing of bulls, added their voices to the din. The psychological effect on the Romans was immediate and profound. These men had fought Etruscans and other Italian peoples who shared similar concepts of warfare and discipline. They had never faced an enemy that seemed to revel in chaos, that appeared to welcome death itself. Veterans in the Roman ranks later admitted that their hands began to shake as they watched the Gallic preparations. Not from fear of death, but from uncertainty about what kind of enemy they were about to face. The Roman deployment followed traditional patterns that had served well in previous campaigns. The hastati, young men in their 20s carrying the standard Roman equipment, formed the first line. Each man bore a scutum, the distinctive rectangular shield that was both protection and weapon, and carried 2 pila, the heavy javelins designed to penetrate armor and disable enemy shields. Their primary weapon was the gladius, the short stabbing sword that had proven devastating in close combat. Behind the hastati stood the principes, men in their prime who formed the backbone of the Roman battle line. These were experienced soldiers who had fought in multiple campaigns and could be counted on to maintain formation even under extreme pressure. Their equipment was similar to that of the hastati, but often of higher quality, reflecting their greater wealth and status within Roman society. The third line consisted of the triarii, veterans who served as the final reserve. These men carried long spears in addition to their swords and were positioned to either support the front lines or serve as a rallying point if retreat became necessary. The triarii were the insurance policy of Roman tactics, the last hope if everything else failed. The Roman cavalry, never the strongest component of their army, was positioned on the flanks along with light troops armed with javelins and slings. The overall formation presented a formidable appearance. Thousands of men in bronze and iron, their shields overlapping to create an almost solid wall, their pila gleaming like a deadly forest above their heads. The Gallic deployment, if it could be called that, followed entirely different principles. Where Romans fought in rigid formations, Gauls organized themselves around kinship groups and personal loyalties. Warriors gathered around their chiefs and heroes, creating loose confederations rather than military units in the Roman sense. Brennus had positioned himself and his personal retinue in the center of the Gallic line, directly opposite where he expected the main Roman attack to fall. The Senones formed the core of his army, but they were supported by warriors from other tribes who had joined the migration or been attracted by the prospect of Roman plunder. The Gallic battle line, if it could be called a line at all, stretched much wider than the Roman formation. This was both an advantage and a disadvantage. It meant the Gauls could potentially envelop the Roman flanks, but it also meant their force was spread thin and difficult to coordinate. As the two armies faced each other across the narrow valley, the differences in their approaches to warfare became starkly apparent. The Romans maintained perfect silence, their officers moving along the lines, making final adjustments to spacing and formation. Every man knew his place, knew his role, and knew exactly what was expected of him when combat began. The Gauls, by contrast, seemed barely contained chaos. Warriors moved freely about the field, challenging individual Romans to single combat, boasting of their deeds, working themselves into the battle frenzy that their culture prized above all else. To Roman eyes, they appeared undisciplined and disorganized. This apparent lack of coordination would soon prove to be a fatal misunderstanding. The battle was initiated, according to Roman custom, by a formal exchange between the commanders. The military tribune sent a herald across the valley to demand that Brennus withdraw from Roman territory and return the property his men had taken during their march south. The Gallic chieftain's response was both simple and decisive. He would withdraw when Rome delivered the Fabii to face Gallic justice. With diplomacy exhausted, the time for battle had arrived. The Roman trumpets sounded, their bronze voices carrying clearly across the valley. In response, the Gallic war horns bellowed their defiance, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The Romans began their advance in perfect formation, each maniple maintaining its spacing, each man keeping his place in the ranks. This was warfare as the Romans understood it, disciplined, coordinated, devastating in its efficiency. The Hastati in the front rank held their shields high and their pila ready, prepared to unleash their javelins at close range before drawing swords for melee combat. But as the Romans descended into the valley, Brennus revealed the tactical sophistication that Roman prejudice had blinded them to. Rather than meeting the Roman advance head-on, he had positioned a large force of his best warriors on the high ground to the Roman right flank, concealed by a fold in the terrain that Roman reconnaissance had failed to detect. As the Roman line reached the bottom of the valley and began climbing the opposite slope, these concealed Gauls erupted from their hiding places with a war cry that shook the earth. Thousands of painted warriors, their long hair streaming behind them, their swords glinting in the morning sun, crashed into the exposed Roman right flank. The psychological shock was overwhelming. Roman soldiers who had been advancing confidently suddenly found themselves attacked from an unexpected direction by enemies who seemed more like monsters than men. The Gallic warriors were not only taller and stronger than most Romans, but they fought with a ferocity that transcended normal human behavior. Individual Gauls would charge directly at Roman shields, heedless of the pila that were thrown at them, seeking to close to sword range where their longer weapons and superior reach gave them devastating advantages. They seemed immune to pain, continuing to fight even when badly wounded, and they showed no fear of death. The Roman right flank, composed largely of cavalry and light troops, simply collapsed. These men were not equipped or trained to stand against determined infantry assault, and the sudden appearance of thousands of screaming Gauls shattered their morale instantly. Within minutes, the entire Roman right wing was in full retreat, streaming back toward Rome in complete disorder. The collapse of the right flank exposed the Hastati to flanking attacks that their formation was never designed to withstand. Roman tactical doctrine assumed that flanks would be secure, that battle would be a matter of line against line in frontal combat. Suddenly facing attacks from multiple directions, the young soldiers of the first line began to waver. It was at this moment that the true genius of Brennus's plan became apparent. The frontal assault by the main Gallic force was not intended to break the Roman line immediately, but to fix it in place while the flanking force did its devastating work. As panic spread through the Roman ranks, Brennus launched his central forces in a massive charge that hit the already shaken Hastati like a thunderbolt. The sound of the Gallic charge was unlike anything the Romans had experienced. Thousands of voices raised in their terrifying war cry. The clash of weapons on shields, the screams of wounded men and horses. It created a cacophony that made communication impossible and coordination nearly so. The Hastati, already under pressure from the flanking attack, could not withstand the frontal assault. Their neat formations dissolved into chaos as individual soldiers fought desperately for their lives against enemies who seemed to tower over them. The Roman pila, so effective against other organized armies, had little impact on Gauls who were willing to take javelin wounds in order to close to sword range. The Principes tried to advance to support the collapsing first line, but they found themselves caught in the chaos as fleeing Hastati streamed back through their ranks. Roman military doctrine had procedures for such situations, but doctrine assumed disciplined troops fighting a conventional enemy. Against the fury of the Gallic assault, Roman training and experience proved inadequate. The collapse of the Hastati and Principes left only the Triarii, the veteran third line, standing between the Gallic host and complete Roman disaster. These grizzled soldiers, men who had fought in countless campaigns and seen every form of warfare known to the Mediterranean world, found themselves facing something entirely unprecedented. The Triarii attempted to form the traditional defensive line that had saved Roman armies in the past. Their long spears presented a hedge of iron points to the advancing Gauls, while their large shields overlapped to create a wall that should have been impenetrable to infantry assault. But the Gallic warriors who now surged toward them were not like any enemy these veterans had faced before. Individual Gauls, their bodies streaming with blood from javelin wounds that would have felled normal men, hurled themselves directly onto the Roman spear points. Their sacrifice cleared gaps in the defensive line that their comrades immediately exploited. Others used their long swords to hook Roman shields and pull them aside, exposing the soldiers behind to devastating cuts from their companions. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical assault. Roman soldiers were accustomed to fighting enemies who valued their own lives, who could be discouraged by casualties, who would retreat when faced with superior discipline. The Gauls seemed to welcome death, to see falling in battle as the highest honor their culture could bestow. Marcus Papirius Mugellanus, one of the 6 military tribunes commanding the Roman army, attempted to rally his men around his personal standard. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Roman discipline might yet prevail. A small knot of soldiers, perhaps 200 men, formed around their commander and began to push back against the Gallic assault. But their heroic stand only attracted more attention from the enemy. Brennus himself, towering above the melee and easily recognizable by his golden torque and magnificent armor, led a charge directly at the Roman position. The Gallic chieftain's personal retinue, warriors who had sworn oaths to die before allowing their leader to fall, carved through the Roman line like a sword through flesh. Mugellanus fell with a Gallic spear through his chest, his blood mixing with that of dozens of his men. With his death, the last organized resistance collapsed. What had begun as a battle now became a massacre, then a rout, and finally a desperate flight for survival. The Roman army, which had marched north with such confidence just hours before, dissolved into a mob of terrified individuals concerned only with saving their own lives. Veterans threw aside their heavy equipment to run faster. Officers abandoned their commands. The proud standards of Rome's legions were left trampled in the mud beside the Allia river. Some Romans attempted to reach the safety of the nearby town of Veii, the Etruscan stronghold they had conquered just 4 years earlier. Others fled directly south toward Rome, spreading panic with their tales of barbarian invincibility. Most simply scattered across the countryside, seeking any refuge they could find from the Gallic pursuit. Brennus, surveying the battlefield littered with Roman dead and abandoned equipment, had achieved something no enemy of Rome had ever accomplished before. He had not merely defeated a Roman army, he had destroyed it so completely that it ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of the 15,000 Romans who had marched north that morning, perhaps a few thousand survived, and most of those would never fight again. The Gallic casualties, by contrast, had been remarkably light. The nature of the battle, with its flanking attacks and psychological warfare, had prevented the kind of sustained combat that might have worn down the barbarian forces. Most Gallic warriors had barely bloodied their swords before the Roman resistance collapsed entirely. But perhaps more important than the casualty figures was the psychological impact of the victory. Rome, which had seemed invincible to its neighbors and allies, had been revealed as vulnerable. The myth of Roman military superiority, built up over generations of successful campaigns, lay shattered beside the Allia River along with the bodies of Rome's soldiers. As news of the disaster spread through central Italy, the carefully constructed system of Roman alliances began to waver. Cities that had submitted to Rome out of respect for its military power began to reconsider their positions. Enemies who had been cowed by Roman threats began to think of revenge. If you're enjoying this journey through Roman history, consider subscribing. It helps us bring more untold stories of empires, battles, and philosophy to life. The immediate question facing both Romans and Gauls was what would happen next. Rome lay practically defenseless, its army destroyed and its population in panic. For Brennus, the victory opened possibilities that must have seemed almost beyond belief. The greatest city in central Italy was his for the taking, along with all the wealth it contained. But the Battle of the Allia had revealed something crucial about both peoples that would shape the events to come. The Romans, for all their defeat, had shown flashes of the courage and determination that would eventually carry them to world dominion. Individual soldiers had fought to the death even when the battle was clearly lost. Officers had died trying to rally their men rather than fleeing to save themselves. The Gauls, meanwhile, had demonstrated that they were far more than the primitive barbarians Roman prejudice had painted them to be. Brennus's tactical planning had been sophisticated and effective. His warriors had shown not just courage but discipline when it mattered most. This was not a rabble that had won through luck, but a formidable military force led by a genuinely capable commander. As the sun set on July 18, 390 BC, the course of Roman history hung in the balance. The city that would one day rule from Britain to Mesopotamia lay helpless before a barbarian army. Everything that Rome had built over the previous century, its alliances, its territories, its reputation, seemed about to be swept away by the Celtic tide. Yet even in this darkest hour, the seeds of Rome's eventual recovery were already present. The disaster at the Allia would force the Romans to confront their own weaknesses, to reform their military system, and to develop the flexibility and pragmatism that would serve them well in future centuries. The defeat would be remembered not just as a catastrophe, but as the moment when Rome began its transformation from a regional Italian power into the greatest empire the world had ever seen. But that transformation lay in the future. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, only one question mattered. Would Rome survive the night? Chandra, Rome's darkest hour, the sack of the Eternal City. The panic that gripped Rome when news of the Allia disaster reached the city was unlike anything in living memory. Refugees streaming south along the Via Salaria brought wild tales of Roman soldiers cut down like wheat before the scythe, of barbarian giants who seemed immune to wounds, of an enemy that would show no mercy to the defeated. The city that had seemed so secure that morning was suddenly revealed as desperately vulnerable. The Servian wall that protected Rome was incomplete, with large sections still under construction or in poor repair. More critically, the assumption that no enemy would ever penetrate so deeply into Roman territory meant that many of the city's defenses were psychological rather than physical. Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, one of the few senior magistrates remaining in the city, attempted to organize a defense. But with the army destroyed and panic spreading through the population, his options were severely limited. The remaining military forces consisted mainly of boys too young for regular service and old men past their prime. The city's allied communities, learning of the Roman defeat, were far more concerned with their own safety than with coming to Rome's aid. In this desperate situation, the Romans made a decision that revealed both their pragmatic nature and their deep attachment to their homeland. Rather than attempt a hopeless defense of the entire city, they would concentrate their remaining forces on the most defensible position available, the Capitoline Hill. The Capitoline, smallest of Rome's 7 hills, was also the most sacred. Here stood the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the dwelling place of Rome's chief god and the symbol of the city's divine protection. The hill's steep slopes and narrow approaches made it naturally defensible, and its religious significance made it the one place where Romans might be expected to fight to the death. The evacuation of Rome began even before the Gallic army came into sight. Citizens gathered their most precious possessions and fled to allied cities or fortified positions in the surrounding countryside. The Vestal Virgins, guardians of Rome's sacred flame, prepared to abandon their temple for the first time in the city's history, taking with them the sacred objects whose loss would mean the end of Rome's divine favor. But not all Romans chose flight. A corps of determined defenders, perhaps 1,000 men in total, made their way to the Capitoline along with their families and whatever supplies they could carry. These were not just soldiers, but senators, magistrates, and ordinary citizens who preferred death to the dishonor of abandoning their city. The rest of Rome's population faced a terrible choice. They could attempt to flee, risking capture by Gallic patrols that were already ranging far ahead of the main army. Or they could remain in the city and trust to Gallic mercy, a commodity that Roman prejudice suggested did not exist. Most chose to stay, barricading themselves in their homes and hoping that the barbarians would be satisfied with plunder rather than massacre. The city that had bustled with activity that morning fell eerily silent as its inhabitants waited for an enemy unlike any they had ever faced. Brennus and his army reached the outskirts of Rome 3 days after the battle, having taken their time to scout the city's defenses and round up Roman stragglers. What they found must have exceeded their wildest expectations. The greatest city in central Italy lay spread before them like a feast, its gates open, its walls undefended, its streets empty of resistance. The Gallic entry into Rome was less a military operation than a victory parade. Warriors who had expected to fight their way through defended walls instead walked unopened through gates that no foreign enemy had ever breached. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. For the Gauls, confirmation of their complete victory; for the Romans, proof that their world had truly ended. What followed has been debated by historians for over 2 millennia. Roman sources written centuries after the event paint a picture of systematic destruction and brutality. Gallic warriors, they claimed, burned buildings at random, slaughtered civilians without mercy, and desecrated the temples of the gods. Modern historians, however, suggest that the reality was probably more complex. Brennus was not leading a mob, but a migrating people that included women, children, and elderly members who needed shelter and supplies. Complete destruction of the city would have been counterproductive, depriving the Gauls of the very resources they needed for their continued survival. More likely, the occupation involved selective destruction designed to break Roman resistance while preserving the city's basic infrastructure. Archaeological evidence from Rome supports this more nuanced view. While there are clear signs of burning and destruction from this period, they are concentrated in certain areas rather than spread uniformly throughout the city. The pattern suggests targeted violence rather than indiscriminate destruction. What is certain is that the Gauls made no immediate attempt to assault the Capitoline Hill. Brennus was too experienced a commander to waste his warriors' lives in costly attacks on a strongly fortified position when time was on his side. Instead, he established a loose siege, content to let hunger and despair do what direct assault might not achieve. The defenders on the Capitoline found themselves in an impossible situation. They had supplies for perhaps a few weeks, but no prospect of relief from outside. Their allies were either too distant or too concerned with their own safety to risk challenging the Gallic army. Worse yet, some Roman allies began to see the Gallic victory as an opportunity to throw off Roman domination entirely. The siege dragged on through the hot summer months of 390 BC. On the Capitoline, the defenders faced increasing hardships as their supplies dwindled and disease began to spread through their overcrowded ranks. In the city below, the Gallic occupation settled into a routine of systematic plunder combined with increasingly desperate attempts to force the hill's surrender. It was during this siege that one of the most famous stories in Roman history supposedly occurred. According to tradition, a group of young Gauls attempted a night assault on the Capitoline, climbing the steep cliffs that the Romans had assumed were unscalable. They might have succeeded in surprising the defenders, but their approach disturbed the sacred geese of Juno, whose honking alerted Marcus Manlius Capitolinus to the danger. Manlius, awakened by the geese, single-handedly threw back the first Gallic warrior to reach the summit, then roused the guards to repel the entire assault. The story, whether literally true or not, captures something essential about Roman character. The idea that divine favor, personal courage, and alertness to duty could overcome even the most desperate circumstances. But even divine intervention could not solve the fundamental problem facing the Roman defenders. They were trapped on a hilltop with dwindling supplies, facing an enemy that seemed content to wait indefinitely for their surrender. Something had to change, or the last remnant of Roman independence would slowly starve to death while watching their city burn below. The solution, when it came, revealed the pragmatic flexibility that would serve Rome well in future crises. If the Romans could not defeat the Gauls militarily, perhaps they could buy them off. Brennus had not come to Italy to destroy Rome permanently, but to find new lands and wealth for his people. If the Romans could offer him enough gold, he might be persuaded to take his army elsewhere. Secret negotiations began between the Roman defenders and the Gallic chieftain. The talks were complicated by questions of honor on both sides. Roman dignity demanded that any agreement not appear as abject surrender, while Gallic pride required that their complete victory be acknowledged. But both sides had practical incentives to reach an accommodation. For the Romans, even a humiliating peace was better than extinction. They could rebuild their armies, repair their walls, and prepare for future conflicts if they could survive the immediate crisis. For Brennus, 1,000 pounds of gold was worth more than a ruined city and a few hundred Roman corpses. His people needed wealth and supplies, not empty victories. The negotiations revealed yet another aspect of Roman character that would prove crucial in future centuries: the ability to accept short-term humiliation in service of long-term survival. Lesser peoples might have chosen death before dishonor, but the Romans possessed the flexibility to bend rather than break when circumstances demanded it. But even as the terms of ransom were being discussed, events were unfolding that would transform this story of defeat into something approaching redemption. The Romans had not forgotten that their greatest general was still alive, still capable of striking back at the enemies who had humiliated his city. Marcus Furius Camillus, exiled on trumped-up charges just months before the Gallic invasion, was about to make his return to history in the most dramatic fashion possible. The man who had conquered Veii would now attempt something even more ambitious: the liberation of Rome itself. Iamdunum, the return of Camillus, Rome's last hope. While Rome burned and its defenders starved on the Capitoline Hill, the exiled Marcus Furius Camillus was gathering the scattered remnants of Roman power in the hill towns south of the city. The man who had been Rome's greatest general before his political downfall now found himself in the position of being Rome's last hope for survival. Camillus was no ordinary Roman commander. His victory over Veii had been achieved through a combination of military innovation, psychological warfare, and sheer determination that marked him as one of the most capable generals of his generation. More importantly, he possessed something that Rome's other leaders lacked: the personal authority to unite the various Roman forces that had survived the Allia disaster. The challenge facing Camillus was enormous. The main Roman army had been destroyed, the city occupied, and many of Rome's allies were wavering in their loyalty. He would have to rebuild Roman military power almost from nothing, using whatever resources he could scrape together from the ruins of the Republic's previous strength. His first task was to gather the survivors of the Allia battle who had scattered across the Roman countryside. Many of these men had thrown away their weapons and armor in their flight, but they retained their military training and, more importantly, their hatred of the enemy who had humiliated them. Veterans who had fled in panic from the Gallic charge could still form the core of a new army if properly led and equipped. Camillus established his base at Ardea, a Latin city that had remained loyal to Rome despite the disaster. Here he began the painstaking work of reconstruction, calling in favors, making promises, and using his personal reputation to convince wavering allies that Rome could still be saved. The political situation was almost as complex as the military one. Technically, Camillus was still in exile, stripped of his citizenship and barred from holding any Roman office. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and the Senate, or what remained of it on the Capitoline, had little choice but to overlook legal niceties. According to Roman tradition, a messenger was sent through the Gallic lines to the Capitoline, carrying the Senate's formal recall of Camillus and his appointment as dictator, the emergency magistrate with unlimited power to deal with threats to the state. The story of this messenger's journey, sneaking through enemy territory and scaling the cliffs of the Capitoline under cover of darkness, became one of the heroic tales that Romans would tell their children for generations. Whether the story is literally true matters less than what it represents. The Roman determination to maintain legal and constitutional procedures, even in the face of complete military disaster. Even when their city was occupied by barbarians, the Romans insisted on following proper procedures for the appointment of their commanders. Camillus accepted the dictatorship and immediately set about the task of raising a new army. This force would be very different from the legions that had marched north to the Allia. Instead of the citizen soldiers who formed the backbone of Roman military power, Camillus had to work with whatever materials were available. Survivors of the original disaster, allies of questionable loyalty, and volunteers drawn by the promise of revenge and plunder. The new army also included a significant number of non-Roman Italians who saw the Gallic occupation as a threat to their own independence. The success of Brennus had encouraged other barbarian tribes to cross the Alps, and the entire peninsula seemed in danger of being overrun by Celtic invaders. For many Italian communities, supporting Camillus was a matter of survival rather than loyalty to Rome. As summer turned to autumn, Camillus's forces grew steadily. The army that assembled around Ardea was not large by the standards of Rome's previous campaigns, but it represented something new in Roman military thinking. A more flexible, adaptable force that could respond to unconventional enemies with unconventional tactics. Camillus had learned from the disaster at the Allia. His new army was organized with greater attention to reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. Scouts ranged far ahead of the main force, gathering information about Gallic dispositions and movements. The Romans would never again march blindly toward an enemy they did not understand. More importantly, Camillus adapted Roman tactics to deal with the specific challenges posed by Gallic warfare. Where previous Roman commanders had relied on rigid formations and frontal assaults, Camillus emphasized flexibility and speed. His troops were trained to operate in smaller units that could respond quickly to changing battlefield conditions. The psychological dimension was equally important. The new army was filled with men who had personal reasons to hate the Gauls, survivors of the Allia who wanted revenge, Romans whose homes had been burned, allies who had seen their own territories threatened. This was not just another military campaign, but a war of liberation and vengeance. Meanwhile, in Rome itself, the siege of the Capitoline continued with growing desperation on both sides. The Roman defenders were reduced to eating leather and bark, while disease spread through their overcrowded ranks. Several attempts to break out had failed with heavy casualties, and the situation appeared hopeless. The Gauls, however, were facing their own problems. The wealth of Rome, while substantial, was not infinite, and feeding an army of 30,000 warriors along with their families was an enormous logistical challenge. Moreover, news was reaching Brennus of Roman resistance forming in the south and of other Italian tribes beginning to mobilize against the Gallic presence. The ransom negotiations that had begun months earlier now took on increased urgency for both sides. The Romans needed to end the siege before their last defenders starved to death. The Gauls needed to extract maximum profit from their victory before facing renewed Roman resistance. The terms that were eventually agreed upon reflected the desperate situation of both parties. Rome would pay 1,000 pounds of gold for the withdrawal of the Gallic army, an enormous sum that would require melting down temple treasures and private wealth. In return, Brennus would lift the siege and lead his people back north, leaving Rome to rebuild. The ceremony marking the payment of the ransom became one of the most humiliating moments in early Roman history. Roman officials, their faces drawn with hunger and defeat, were forced to weigh out gold under the eyes of their barbarian conquerors. When the Romans complained that the Gallic scales were rigged to demand more gold than had been agreed upon, Brennus supposedly threw his sword onto the scale, declaring, "Vae victis!" Woe to the conquered! This moment of supreme humiliation was seared into Roman memory and would drive much of their future expansion. Never again would Rome allow itself to be in a position where barbarians could dictate terms. Never again would Roman gold buy what Roman swords should defend. But even as the ransom was being paid, Camillus and his army were approaching Rome from the south. The dictator had timed his march carefully, waiting until the Gauls were relaxed by their apparent victory and burdened by the wealth they had extorted from their enemies. What happened next would transform a story of defeat into one of redemption, a tale of humiliation into one of triumph. The Battle of the Allia had shown Rome at its weakest, but the events that followed would reveal the resilience and determination that would carry Rome to world dominion. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Rome, but the future course of Western civilization. On one side stood Brennus and his Gallic warriors, confident in their complete victory and laden with Roman gold. On the other side approached Camillus and his makeshift army, burning with the desire to avenge their humiliation and restore Roman honor. The collision between these forces would produce one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. A victory so complete that it would erase the shame of the Allia and establish Camillus as the second founder of Rome. The hour of redemption, Camillus strikes back. The approach of Camillus and his army toward Rome in the autumn of 390 BC marked one of the most dramatic moments in the city's early history. The dictator had spent months carefully preparing for this moment, gathering intelligence about Gallic dispositions, training his troops in new tactics, and building the political coalition that would support his campaign of liberation. The army that marched north toward Rome bore little resemblance to the force that had been destroyed at the Allia. Where the original legions had been composed primarily of Roman citizens following traditional formations, Camillus's force was a more diverse and flexible instrument of war. Roman survivors mixed with Latin allies, Hernician mountain fighters, and even some Etruscan volunteers who saw the Gallic occupation as a threat to all of central Italy. This diversity, which might have been a weakness in earlier Roman armies, became a strength under Camillus's leadership. Different contingents brought different fighting styles and tactical approaches, giving the Roman commander options that had not been available to his predecessors. The mountain fighters were expert in ambush warfare. The Etruscans brought superior metalworking skills, and the Latin allies provided the numerical strength necessary to face the still formidable Gallic host. Camillus had also learned crucial lessons from the Allia disaster about the nature of Gallic warfare. His scouts had spent months observing the enemy, learning their habits, their strengths, and their weaknesses. The Romans now understood that Gallic warriors, for all their individual courage and skill, lacked the discipline for sustained operations. They were raiders rather than occupiers, better suited to quick strikes than long-term administration. More importantly, Camillus had identified a critical vulnerability in the Gallic position. Brennus's army, after months of occupation and plunder, had grown soft and overconfident. They had scattered throughout the city, more concerned with guarding their individual hoards of treasure than maintaining military readiness. The tight discipline that had carried them to victory at the Allia had given way to the natural tendency of warrior societies to celebrate their triumphs. The timing of Camillus's approach was also carefully calculated. He had waited until after the ransom payment, knowing that the Gauls would be at their most vulnerable, loaded down with gold, preparing to depart, and psychologically ready to consider their campaign complete. It was a moment when surprise might achieve what direct confrontation could not. The first contact between Camillus's forces and the Gallic army occurred not in Rome itself, but at a small town called Gabii, about 12 miles east of the city. A Gallic foraging party laden with plunder and moving carelessly through territory they considered secure stumbled into a Roman ambush. The result was a massacre that sent shockwaves through both armies. The Gauls, caught completely off guard, were cut down almost to a man. More importantly for Roman morale, The engagement demonstrated that the barbarians who had seemed invincible at the Allia were not immune to defeat when faced with properly planned Roman tactics. News of the ambush reached Rome quickly, causing panic in the Gallic ranks and joy among any Romans who learned of it. Brennus, recognizing that his situation had become much more dangerous, began preparations to withdraw from the city with his treasure intact. But Camillus was not about to let his enemies escape so easily. The dictator's strategy was to force a decisive engagement before the Gauls could organize their retreat. Moving with unprecedented speed for a Roman army, his forces approached Rome from multiple directions, preventing Brennus from choosing his own battlefield and forcing the Gallic chieftain to fight at a disadvantage. The final battle took place on the Campus Martius, the field of Mars just outside Rome's walls where Roman armies had traditionally assembled before campaigns. The symbolism was deliberate. Camillus was not just fighting to defeat an enemy, but to reclaim Rome's sacred spaces from barbarian contamination. The engagement began at dawn, with both armies deploying in formations that reflected their very different approaches to warfare. The Romans advanced in their traditional manipular formation, but with modifications that Camillus had developed specifically to counter Gallic tactics. The Hastati were supported by additional light troops armed with javelins, while the cavalry was positioned to exploit any gaps that might appear in the enemy line. The Gauls, meanwhile, assembled in their characteristic loose formations, but their deployment revealed the problems that months of occupation had created. Many warriors were more concerned with protecting their individual treasure than with military coordination. Others had grown soft from months of city living, losing the edge that had made them so formidable at the Allia. Brennus himself recognized these problems and attempted to address them through personal leadership. The Gallic chieftain took his position at the front of his warriors, his golden torque gleaming in the morning sun, his presence designed to inspire his followers to recreate their earlier triumph. But this was not the same army that had crossed the Alps months earlier. The Gauls had lost something intangible but crucial: the unity of purpose that comes from shared hardship and common goals. They were no longer a migrating people seeking new homes, but a collection of individuals concerned primarily with preserving their personal gains. Camillus, by contrast, commanded an army that was burning with unified purpose. Every man in the Roman ranks had personal reasons to hate the enemy they faced. They had seen their city occupied, their temples defiled, their fellow citizens humiliated. This was not just another campaign, but a war of liberation that touched the deepest emotions of every soldier. The battle began, like the engagement at the Allia, with the exchange of missile weapons. But this time, the Romans were prepared for the psychological shock of facing Gallic warriors. Camillus had drilled his men extensively in maintaining formation under pressure, and the sight of painted barbarians rushing toward them no longer inspired panic. The Roman pila proved devastatingly effective against enemies who lacked the tight discipline of their earlier campaigns. Gallic warriors, charging individually or in small groups rather than in coordinated masses, were cut down by javelin volleys that had been carefully timed and coordinated. When the lines finally closed for melee combat, the Romans demonstrated that they had learned from their earlier defeat. Rather than meeting the Gallic charge head-on, they employed flexible tactics that used the enemy's own momentum against them. Small units of Romans would give ground, drawing individual Gauls into traps where they could be surrounded and overwhelmed. The turning point came when Camillus personally led a charge against Brennus and his personal retinue. The two commanders, representing their entire peoples, met in single combat that decided the fate of central Italy. Camillus, fighting with the desperation of a man defending his homeland, proved superior to the Gallic chieftain who had grown overconfident from months of easy victory. Brennus fell with a Roman sword through his chest, his golden torque claimed by the dictator as a trophy of victory. With their leader dead and their formation already showing signs of strain, the Gallic army began to disintegrate. What had begun as an organized withdrawal quickly became a rout, The Roman pursuit was merciless and complete. Warriors who had terrorized central Italy for months found themselves hunted through the streets of Rome by enemies who showed no more mercy than they had received. The gold that the Gauls had extorted from the city was recaptured, along with much of the other treasure they had accumulated during their occupation. More importantly, the psychological balance of power in central Italy was completely reversed. The Gauls, who had seemed invincible after the Allia, were revealed to be as vulnerable to defeat as any other enemy. Rome, which had appeared to be finished as a major power, demonstrated the resilience and determination that would carry it to world dominion. The victory was so complete that it immediately entered Roman legend. Camillus was hailed as the second founder of Rome, the man who had saved the city when all seemed lost. The defeat of Brennus was celebrated as proof that Roman virtue could triumph over any enemy, no matter how formidable they might initially appear. But perhaps more important than the immediate military victory were the long-term lessons that Rome drew from the entire experience. The disaster at the Allia and the subsequent occupation had revealed fundamental weaknesses in Roman society and military organization. The victory under Camillus showed how these weaknesses could be overcome through adaptation, determination, and inspired leadership. The Rome that emerged from this crisis was a very different city from the one that had marched confidently north to face Brennus months earlier. It was a Rome that had learned the price of overconfidence, the value of good intelligence, and the importance of military flexibility. Most importantly, it was a Rome that had discovered its own capacity for resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. Through aftermath and transformation, Rome reborn. The immediate aftermath of Camillus's victory was a period of both celebration and reckoning for Rome. The city that had been occupied by barbarians for 7 months was finally free, but the scars of that occupation ran deep. Buildings had been burned, temples defiled, and the psychological trauma of foreign domination would influence Roman thinking for generations to come. The physical reconstruction of Rome began immediately. The Forum, which had been turned into a Gallic marketplace, was ceremonially purified and restored to its proper function as the center of Roman political life. The temples that had been looted were rebuilt, often more magnificently than before, as Romans sought to demonstrate that their faith in the gods had not been shaken by temporary defeat. But the most significant changes were not visible to the eye. The Rome that emerged from the Gallic crisis was fundamentally different from the city that had existed before the Battle of the Allia. The experience of near extinction had forced the Romans to confront their own weaknesses and to develop new approaches to warfare, politics, and foreign relations. The most immediate military reforms focused on intelligence gathering and strategic planning. Never again would a Roman army march toward an unknown enemy without thorough reconnaissance. New procedures were established for scouting, map-making, and the collection of information about potential enemies. The disaster at the Allia had been caused in large part by Roman ignorance about their opponents, and this would not be allowed to happen again. Roman military organization also underwent significant changes. The rigid manipular system that had proved vulnerable to Gallic tactics was modified to provide greater flexibility. New training regimens emphasized adaptability and rapid response to changing battlefield conditions. The Romans had learned that different enemies required different approaches, and their military system was reformed to accommodate this reality. Perhaps more importantly, Rome's approach to warfare itself began to change. The confident assumptions about Roman superiority that had led to the Allia disaster were replaced by a more cautious and thorough approach to military planning. Romans would still fight with tremendous courage and determination, but they would do so with better preparation and more realistic assessment of their enemies' capabilities. The political consequences of the crisis were equally significant. Camillus's success as dictator had demonstrated the value of unified command in times of emergency, but it had also raised questions about the balance of power within the Roman constitution. The traditional system of annual magistrates and collective decision-making had proved inadequate to deal with existential threats to the state. The solution that emerged was a more flexible approach to emergency powers. While the Romans remained committed to their republican institutions, they developed procedures for concentrating authority when circumstances demanded it. The dictatorship, previously used mainly for specific military campaigns, became a more regular feature of Roman crisis management. The Senate, too, emerged from the crisis with enhanced authority. The body that had once been merely advisory to the magistrates now took on a more central role in foreign policy and military planning. The Gallic invasion had demonstrated the need for institutional memory and long-term strategic thinking that could only come from a permanent council of experienced leaders. Rome's foreign policy underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. The confident assumption that Roman strength alone was sufficient to maintain security gave way to a more sophisticated understanding of alliance building and diplomatic relationships. The Romans had learned that they could not stand alone against the threats that surrounded them. The immediate result was a series of new treaties with Latin and Italian communities that had supported Rome during the crisis. These agreements went beyond the traditional patterns of Roman hegemony, offering genuine partnership and mutual support rather than mere submission to Roman authority. The Romans had discovered that willing allies were more valuable than reluctant subjects. More significantly, Rome began to develop what would become one of its greatest strengths, the ability to incorporate former enemies into the Roman system. Some of the Gallic warriors who had survived the final battle were offered the opportunity to settle in Roman territory as foederati, allied troops who would fight for Rome in exchange for land and citizenship rights. This policy of inclusion, which would eventually extend Roman citizenship to peoples across the Mediterranean world, had its origins in the practical necessities of the post-Gallic period. Rome needed manpower to replace the losses suffered at the Allia, and the most efficient way to obtain it was to offer membership in the Roman community to those who were willing to fight for it. The economic consequences of the Gallic occupation were equally transformative. The ransom payment had drained Rome's treasury and forced the liquidation of many private fortunes. But the recovery of this treasure, along with the additional plunder taken from the defeated Gallic army, actually left Rome wealthier than before the invasion. More importantly, the crisis had demonstrated the vulnerability of wealth that was not properly defended. The Romans began to invest more heavily in military infrastructure. Better walls, stronger fortifications, and the weapons and equipment necessary to maintain their expanded army. The city that had been caught unprepared by the Gallic invasion would never again be so vulnerable to surprise attack. The psychological impact of the entire experience was perhaps the most profound of all. The Romans had discovered that they could survive even complete military disaster if they maintained their determination and adapted their methods. This lesson in resilience would serve them well in the centuries to come, as they faced enemies from Pyrrhus to Hannibal who would test their resolve in similar ways. The collective trauma of the Gallic occupation also created a shared sense of purpose that transcended the traditional divisions of Roman society. Patricians and plebeians who had often been at odds found common cause in rebuilding their city and preventing future disasters. The class conflicts that had dominated Roman politics before 390 BC did not disappear, but they were tempered by the recognition that internal divisions made Rome vulnerable to external enemies. Religious and cultural changes were equally significant. The Romans had always believed in their special relationship with the gods, but the Gallic invasion had shaken this faith. How could Jupiter have allowed barbarians to occupy his temple on the Capitoline? How could the gods have permitted such humiliation of their chosen people? The answer that emerged reflected the practical Roman approach to religion. The gods had not abandoned Rome, but they had tested it. The disaster at the Allia was divine punishment for Roman arrogance and complacency. while the victory under Camillus demonstrated that proper virtue and determination would always be rewarded. This interpretation allowed the Romans to maintain their religious confidence while acknowledging the need for greater humility and preparation. New religious practices emerged from the crisis that would become permanent features of Roman culture. The cult of Jupiter Optimus Maximus was elevated to even greater prominence, while new festivals were established to commemorate the liberation of the city. The Romans also began to pay more attention to foreign gods and religious practices, recognizing that their own traditions might benefit from outside influences. The story of the Gallic invasion was immediately incorporated into the growing body of Roman historical legend. The disaster at the Allia became a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence, while Camillus's victory was celebrated as proof of Roman virtue and divine favor. These stories would be told and retold for generations, shaping Roman identity and providing moral lessons for future leaders. Perhaps most importantly, the entire experience established patterns of Roman behavior that would persist throughout the Republic and into the Empire. The ability to learn from defeat, to adapt tactics to meet new challenges, and to turn disaster into opportunity became defining characteristics of Roman civilization. The impact on Rome's enemies was equally significant. The Gallic tribes north of the Alps had learned that Roman wealth was real and substantial, but they had also discovered that Romans would fight ferociously to defend their homeland. Future Gallic invasions would be more cautious and better prepared, but they would also face a Rome that was no longer vulnerable to surprise attack. More broadly, the entire Mediterranean world had watched Rome's response to existential crisis with great interest. The city that had seemed on the verge of extinction had not only survived but emerged stronger than before. This demonstration of Roman resilience sent a powerful message to potential allies and enemies alike about the character of the people who controlled central Italy. The immediate territorial consequences of the crisis were relatively modest. Rome did not embark on massive campaigns of conquest in the aftermath of Camillus's victory. Instead, the focus was on consolidating control over existing territories and strengthening the alliance system that had proved crucial to Roman survival. However, the long-term territorial implications were enormous. The military and political reforms that emerged from the Gallic crisis provided the foundation for Rome's eventual conquest of Italy and the Mediterranean world. The flexible military system, the inclusive approach to citizenship, and the sophisticated alliance networks that would carry Roman armies to the ends of the earth all had their origins in the lessons learned from Brennus and his warriors. The transformation was not immediate or complete. Roman society in 389 BC still bore many resemblances to the city that had existed before the invasion. But the seeds of future greatness had been planted in the soil of disaster and watered with the blood of defeat. The Rome that would eventually rule from Britain to Mesopotamia was born in the ashes of the Gallic occupation. Individual Romans who lived through the crisis carried its lessons with them for the rest of their lives. Veterans of the Allia disaster, if they survived, became valuable sources of tactical knowledge about unconventional enemies. The children who had hidden on the Capitoline Hill grew up with a visceral understanding of the importance of military preparedness and political unity. Camillus himself became the embodiment of Roman resilience and adaptability. His example would inspire future generations of Roman leaders who faced seemingly impossible challenges. The man who had been exiled in disgrace and recalled in desperation became the model of the citizen who puts duty to the state above personal grievance. The economic lessons of the crisis were equally enduring. Romans had learned that wealth without security was meaningless, but they had also discovered that temporary sacrifice could lead to greater prosperity. The city that had paid ransom to barbarians would eventually extract tribute from the civilized world. But it would do so with armies that were prepared for any enemy and walls that could withstand any siege. Sardafunon legacy and lessons, the eternal impact of Rome's first defeat. as we look back across more than 2 millennia. The Battle of the Allia and its aftermath stand as one of history's most instructive examples of how civilizations respond to existential crisis. The lessons that Rome drew from this disaster shaped not only the subsequent course of Roman history but the very foundations of Western civilization itself. The most immediate lesson was the danger of cultural arrogance. The Romans of 390 BC had believed that their military system was inherently superior to anything they might face, that their civilization gave them automatic advantages over barbarian enemies. The Gallic invasion shattered these comfortable assumptions and forced the Romans to confront the reality that survival required constant adaptation and improvement. This lesson in humility paradoxically became one of the sources of Roman strength. Unlike many ancient civilizations that were rigid and inflexible, Rome developed a remarkable capacity to learn from its enemies and incorporate their best practices. The Romans who survived the Gallic crisis were those who could adapt their thinking to new realities, and this adaptability became a defining characteristic of Roman culture. The military innovations that emerged from the crisis had profound long-term consequences. The flexible tactical systems developed by Camillus evolved over the following centuries into the manipular and later cohort organizations that would conquer the Mediterranean world. The emphasis on intelligence gathering and strategic planning became fundamental aspects of Roman military doctrine. More importantly, the Romans learned to see warfare as a science rather than merely an art. The disaster at the Allia had been caused by poor planning and inadequate preparation as much as by tactical mistakes. Future Roman campaigns would be characterized by meticulous logistics, careful reconnaissance, and thorough understanding of enemy capabilities. The political lessons of the crisis were equally significant. The Romans had discovered that their traditional governmental system, while admirable in peacetime, needed modification to deal with emergency situations. The enhanced authority of the dictatorship and the Senate that emerged from this period provided Rome with the institutional flexibility to respond effectively to future crises. Perhaps more importantly, the crisis demonstrated the value of political unity in the face of external threats. The class conflicts that had dominated pre-invasion Roman politics did not disappear, but they were moderated by the recognition that internal divisions weakened Rome against its enemies. This lesson would serve Rome well in future centuries as it faced challenges from Pyrrhus, Hannibal, and other formidable opponents. The social and cultural impact of the Gallic invasion was equally profound. The shared trauma of foreign occupation created bonds of solidarity that transcended traditional social divisions. Romans who had lived through the crisis possessed a common understanding of their civilization's vulnerability and the price of its survival. This shared experience also reinforced certain Roman values that would become central to their imperial success. The importance of discipline, the value of perseverance in the face of adversity, and the necessity of placing communal survival above individual interests were all lessons dramatically illustrated by the events of 393–89 BC. The religious and philosophical implications of the crisis were more subtle, but no less important. The Romans had always believed in their special relationship with the gods, but the Gallic invasion forced them to develop a more sophisticated understanding of divine favor. They learned that the gods helped those who helped themselves, that virtue without preparation was insufficient, and that temporary setbacks did not necessarily indicate permanent abandonment. This more nuanced approach to religion would serve Rome well as it encountered the diverse cultures and belief systems of the Mediterranean world. The Romans who had learned to question their own assumptions about divine favor were better equipped to understand and incorporate foreign religious practices when they proved useful. The economic lessons of the crisis were equally enduring. The Romans learned that true wealth lay not in accumulated treasure but in the productive capacity of their citizens and allies. The gold that had been extorted by Brennus was recovered, but more importantly, Rome developed the economic systems that would eventually make it the richest city in the world. The crisis also taught Romans the value of investment in security. The walls, weapons, and military infrastructure that were built or improved in the aftermath of the invasion provided the foundation for centuries of expansion. Romans learned to see military expenditure not as a burden but as an investment in future prosperity. From a broader historical perspective, the Gallic invasion of 390 BC can be seen as one of the crucial turning points that shaped the development of European civilization. Had Rome fallen permanently to Brennus, the subsequent history of the Mediterranean world would have been entirely different. Greek culture might have remained dominant, or new powers might have emerged to fill the vacuum left by Rome's destruction. Instead, Rome's survival and transformation after the crisis set in motion the chain of events that would eventually unite the Mediterranean world under Roman rule. The military, political, and cultural innovations that emerged from this disaster provided the tools that Roman armies and administrators would use to build and maintain their empire. The lesson of resilience that Rome learned in 390 BC would be tested repeatedly in the centuries that followed. When Hannibal crossed the Alps and destroyed Roman armies at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae, the Romans responded with the same determination they had shown after the Allia. When Germanic tribes threatened the northern frontiers, Roman leaders drew on the same capacity for adaptation and strategic thinking that Camillus had demonstrated. Even the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD can be seen as a failure to apply the lessons of the Gallic invasion. The Romans of that later period had lost the flexibility and adaptability that their ancestors had learned from Brennus. They had become rigid and inflexible, unable to adapt their institutions to meet new challenges. The story of Rome's first great defeat also provides insights into the nature of civilization itself. The Romans of 390 BC discovered that no society, no matter how successful or sophisticated, is immune to catastrophic failure. But they also learned that catastrophe need not be permanent, that civilizations can recover from even the most devastating setbacks if they possess the will to adapt and the wisdom to learn from their mistakes. This lesson remains relevant today, as modern societies face their own existential challenges. The Romans who survived the Gallic invasion did so not because they were inherently superior to their enemies, but because they were willing to acknowledge their weaknesses and change their methods accordingly. They were pragmatic rather than ideological, flexible rather than rigid, and focused on results rather than theory. The values that emerged from Rome's darkest hour, resilience, adaptability, determination, and the willingness to learn from enemies, remain as relevant today as they were 24 centuries ago. In an age when civilizations again face rapid change and unexpected challenges, the Roman response to the Gallic invasion offers both inspiration and practical guidance. The men who died at the Allia River could not have known that their sacrifice would contribute to one of history's greatest civilizations. The survivors who huddled on the Capitoline Hill could not have imagined that their city would eventually rule the known world. But their responses to crisis, their determination to survive and adapt, created the foundations upon which that world empire was built. Marcus Furius Camillus, who had been exiled in disgrace and recalled in desperation, became the embodiment of Roman virtue precisely because he demonstrated the qualities that would make Rome great: the ability to put aside personal grievances for the common good, the flexibility to adapt tactics to meet new challenges, and the determination never to accept defeat as final. The Battle of the Allia was Rome's first great defeat, but it was also the beginning of Rome's greatest transformation. In learning how to survive catastrophe, the Romans learned how to thrive in a dangerous world. In discovering their own vulnerability, they found the strength that would carry them to the ends of the earth. Eternal questions. Rome's living legacy. As we reach the end of this journey through one of Rome's darkest chapters, we're left with questions that echo across the centuries and speak directly to our own times. The Battle of the Allia and its aftermath offer us more than just a historical narrative. They provide a mirror in which we can examine our own civilizations, our own assumptions, and our own responses to crisis. The first and perhaps most important question is about the nature of resilience itself. The Romans of 390 BC faced what seemed like complete destruction. Their army annihilated, their city occupied, their very survival in doubt. Yet within months they had not only recovered but emerged stronger than before. What was it about Roman culture, Roman institutions, or Roman character that made this remarkable recovery possible? Some historians argue that Rome's resilience came from its political system, with its emphasis on collective decision-making and institutional continuity. Others point to Roman military culture with its discipline and adaptability. Still others see the key in Roman pragmatism, their willingness to abandon failed strategies and adopt new ones regardless of pride or precedent. Perhaps the truth encompasses all of these factors. Roman resilience may have emerged from the interaction between flexible institutions, practical culture, and individual character shaped by generations of struggle and competition. The Romans had learned even before the Gallic invasion that survival required constant effort and adaptation. But this raises another crucial question. Can resilience be taught, or must it be learned through bitter experience? The Romans who marched north to the Allia were confident and well-trained, but they lacked the hard-won wisdom that comes from facing existential threats. It was only after experiencing complete defeat that they developed the flexibility and determination that would serve them so well in future crises. This has profound implications for modern societies that have enjoyed long periods of peace and prosperity. Can we learn the lessons of adaptability and resilience without first experiencing catastrophic failure? The Roman example suggests that while institutional knowledge can be preserved, the deeper wisdom that comes from facing genuine crisis may require actual experience of adversity. The question of leadership is equally fascinating. Camillus succeeded where others had failed not because he possessed superior military skills or political connections, but because he understood that fighting the Gauls required fundamentally different approaches from fighting other Italian enemies. His greatness lay not in his adherence to established doctrine, but in his willingness to abandon it when circumstances demanded. This raises important questions about the nature of leadership in times of crisis. Are our institutions designed to promote leaders who can think beyond conventional wisdom? Do we reward the kind of flexible thinking that allowed Camillus to develop new tactics for unprecedented challenges? Or do our systems tend to promote leaders who excel at managing existing systems rather than transforming them? The role of culture and values in determining civilizational survival is another crucial theme. The Romans possessed certain cultural characteristics: discipline, persistence, pragmatism, and a willingness to learn from enemies that served them well in crisis. But they also had cultural blind spots, particularly their arrogance toward barbarian peoples, that made them vulnerable to surprise and defeat. Modern societies face similar challenges in balancing confidence with humility, pride in their achievements with recognition of their limitations. The Roman experience suggests that civilizations are most vulnerable when they become convinced of their own inherent superiority, when they stop learning from their competitors and enemies. The question of military preparedness remains as relevant today as it was in 390 BC. The Romans learned that peace is not a natural state, but something that must be actively maintained through strength and vigilance. They discovered that the capacity for effective military action requires not just weapons and training, but intelligence gathering, strategic thinking, and the institutional framework to support sustained operations. But the Roman experience also demonstrates that military strength alone is insufficient. The legions that were destroyed at the Allia were well-equipped and well-trained by the standards of their time. What they lacked was not military capability, but the intelligence and strategic thinking necessary to employ that capability effectively. This has important implications for how modern societies think about security. Is it enough to maintain sophisticated military capabilities? Or must we also invest in the intelligence gathering, strategic analysis, and institutional flexibility that allow those capabilities to be employed effectively? The Roman example suggests that the latter may be more important than the former. The economic dimensions of the Roman crisis also offer relevant lessons. The wealth that Rome had accumulated through conquest and trade made it an attractive target for enemies, but that same wealth also provided the resources necessary for recovery and eventual victory. The key was learning to see wealth not as an end in itself, but as a tool for maintaining security and independence. Modern societies face similar challenges in balancing prosperity with security, economic growth with military preparedness, and immediate consumption with long-term investment in defense capabilities. The Roman example suggests that sustainable prosperity requires not just the accumulation of wealth, but the wisdom to use it effectively. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Rome's first great defeat reminds us that no civilization is permanent or invulnerable. The Romans of 390 BC had reason to feel confident. They had conquered their traditional enemies, built impressive institutions, and created a military system that seemed superior to anything they might face. Yet within hours, all of these achievements were revealed to be insufficient against an enemy they had not understood or prepared for. This lesson in humility remains as relevant today as it was 24 centuries ago. Our own civilizations, for all their achievements and sophistication, remain vulnerable to challenges we may not anticipate or understand. The Roman example suggests that the key to survival lies not in avoiding such challenges, but in developing the institutional flexibility and cultural resilience necessary to meet them effectively. The transformation that Rome underwent after the Gallic invasion, from a regional Italian power to the master of the Mediterranean world, was not inevitable. It required conscious choices by individual leaders and citizens, institutional reforms that enhanced Roman capabilities, and cultural changes that made Rome more adaptable and inclusive. This raises a final, crucial question. What transformations might our own societies need to undergo to meet the challenges of the coming decades? The Roman example suggests that the societies most likely to thrive are those that can maintain their core values while adapting their methods, that can learn from their enemies without losing their own identity, and that can turn setbacks into opportunities for growth and improvement. Do you think Rome's resilience was born of discipline or luck? Which Roman leader do you think left the strongest legacy? What lesson from Rome feels most relevant today? These are not merely academic questions, but urgent challenges for any society that hopes to survive and flourish in an uncertain world. The Romans who lived through the crisis of 390 BC could not have foreseen that their responses would lay the foundation for one of history's greatest empires. Similarly, we cannot predict the long-term consequences of how our own societies respond to contemporary challenges. But we can learn from the Roman example that crisis, while painful and destructive, can also be transformative. The Rome that emerged from the Gallic invasion was stronger, wiser, and more adaptable than the city that had marched confidently north to the Allia River. The question for our own time is whether we can achieve similar transformation without first experiencing similar catastrophe. The Battle of the Allia reminds us that in the great sweep of history, defeats can be more instructive than victories. Disasters more transformative than triumphs. Rome's first great defeat became the foundation of its greatest achievements. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that what matters is not whether we face setbacks, but how we choose to respond when we do.